Welcome back to Easily Explain, where today we will be talking about indirect object pronouns. So let's get started. So just like we did for direct object pronouns in Spanish, we're going to be splitting this video up into two parts. In today's video, we're just going to practice identifying indirect objects in Spanish particularly, even though we do have an indirect object video for English. Make sure to go check that out because that will still help. And in the next part, we will be going over pronouns and how to replace them and all of the different rules for indirect object pronouns. But first, what are indirect objects? Indirect objects are nouns that answer the question to whom or for whom something is done. And indirect object pronouns, like direct object pronouns, just replace indirect objects. So let's look at some examples, first in English, and then we'll switch over to Spanish examples. If we are looking at English examples, which if you want more of, make sure to go rewatch our indirect objects video. But we will be going over just a little example so that we can apply those same skills to Spanish. We have the example, she gives me the book. The first step, anytime you want to identify anything, the first most foundational step is always to identify the verb. So if you're having trouble with that, make sure to go rewatch our verbs video and all of our other parts of a sentence or parts of speech videos, because those are all foundational topics that we are going to be continuing to build on both in English grammar and in Spanish. So, she gives me the book. The verb or the action is gives. And to identify the subject, we ask the question, who gives or what gives? In this case, our subject is she because she gives. All right. And then when we start talking about direct objects, we said they answer the question like what? She gives what? She gives the book. It is necessary to complete the meaning of the sentence. So that would be our direct object. Our indirect object is the noun that answers to whom or for whom. So she gives the book to whom? She gives it to me. So me is our indirect object in this case. Also, you can think of it as who is being indirectly affected by this situation. Like not the subject is obviously affected, or it's affecting in this case. She gives me the book. She gives who the book? She gives me the book. So me is the indirect object in this case. Also, we also mentioned this in the English indirect objects video, but usually, most of the time, indirect objects are in sentences with direct objects because they need something to base it off of. So you wouldn't find a sentence that just says she gives me. You need something else to complete the meaning, and that would be your direct object. So most of the time you look for indirect objects, you will find a direct object in there as well. So in Spanish, whenever we're using indirect objects, we always use indirect object pronouns. So we wouldn't ever typically say it in the full version, but as an example, I still want to show it. So this is basically saying, ella da el libro a mí, and a means to. So this is saying she gives it to me, but you don't talk like this ever. Whenever you're using an indirect object, you use the indirect object pronoun, and that is different from, let's say, direct objects. So it's really important that you learn indirect object pronouns and how to replace them. But since we're just looking at examples and learning how to identify indirect object pronouns, we can still use these. Ella da el libro a mí. So we have our subject, ella, because our verb is da. It's conjugated from dar, which means to give. El libro is the book. It's the direct object. And a mí, to me, me is the indirect object of this case. But again, we don't talk like this, so we would replace it with the indirect object pronoun, which we are going to learn soon in the next video. And now it's time for practice. So identify the indirect object in each of the 3 sentences below, but also recall that these are unnecessarily long, which is why we need indirect objects in the indirect object pronouns in the first place. And that's why it's so important, and we will be getting on to those very soon. So for now, though, pause the video and complete the practice by identifying the indirect object. Alright, number 1. Ella da tarea a los estudiantes. So we're identifying the indirect object, but the first thing we need to do is identify the verb da. You should be able to identify the verb since it is the most important part in Spanish. So that's why it's very important to get familiar with different types of vocabulary of verbs. Also, know your conjugations very well so that you can immediately recognize this is from the verb dar, which means to give, except it's just conjugated for the ella form. So, ella da means she gives tarea, homework, a los estudiantes, to the students. So we know that da is our verb, ella is our subject. What does she give? She gives homework, she gives tarea. That's our direct object. But right now we're talking about indirect objects. She gives the homework, she gives the tarea to who or to whom? To the students. A los estudiantes. So that is our indirect object. Los estudiantes. They are the ones being indirectly affected by her giving the homework. And she gives it to them. Or she gives it for them. Number 2, we have yo digo hola a ella. Basically what this means is I say hi to her. We know the verb digo comes from this seed, by the way. It's a little bit irregular. And yo is the subject because I'm the one saying. What do I say? I say hola. It's the direct object. And who do I say it to? That's where the indirect object comes in. I say it to, remember that a is to ella, to her. So if this was in English, her would be the indirect object. And lastly, we have nosotros tenemos una pregunta para la maestra. If we were to translate it in English first, we have a question for the teacher. That makes it easy to understand. Tenemos is our verb. Remember, it comes from tener. Nosotros is our subject because we have, what do we have? We have a question. That is our direct object. And para means for. La maestra is the one indirectly affected by the situation. And as you can tell from all of these examples, every single one of them had a direct object in the sentence as well. So that's a very nice trick to figuring out whether a sentence actually has an indirect object is make sure it has a direct object as well. Congratulations, you have now made it through the first part of indirect object pronouns in Spanish. Stay tuned for part 2 so that you too can become an expert. We hope this video really helped, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye!